Lately, we've seen a wave of people boldly claiming that music is halal. They stand on podcasts, in shorts, on TikTok, with the confidence of scholars, saying things that generations of real scholars never dared to say. Some say there's no verse in the Qur'an that forbids it. Some say times have changed, that what was haram 1,400 years ago doesn't apply today. Others go as far as mocking the scholars who spent their lives studying the deen, calling them outdated, calling them ignorant, and saying, "We know better." And what's scary is not that people are saying it. It's that Muslims are believing it. Everywhere you look, there's another video, another clip, normalizing what Allah and His Messenger warned us against. We scroll, we laugh, we move on, but deep down, something in our heart starts to change. The haram starts looking harmless. And the truth starts sounding harsh. This isn't about music anymore. It's about how easily we're fooled when the truth no longer fits our desires. So let's break this down, not with emotions, not with trends, but with knowledge. Welcome to the Companion of Peace TV, where we don't twist Islam to please people. We say things the way they are, clear, direct, and backed by knowledge. In a time where deception spreads faster than truth, this channel stands as a reminder, not everything popular is right, and not everything right will ever be popular. Here, we expose falsehood, especially when it hides behind big smiles, trending audios, and half-baked Islamic opinions. Because truth doesn't need to trend to be true. If you're tired of watered-down Islam, tired of seeing people joke about the deen and call it modern, then this channel is for you. Here, we don't chase views. We chase clarity. We don't follow emotions. We follow evidence. And we don't bend Islam to fit desires, we bend our desires to fit Islam. So if that's the kind of reminder you want, subscribe, and stay with us till the end. Because today, we're going to expose one of the biggest deceptions normalized in our ummah, the lie that music is halal. Now, before we show why the claim that music is halal is wrong, let's first understand why people say it. Because if you want to refute something properly, you have to know exactly what the other side is arguing. Some people say music is halal because they misuse opinions. They take a sentence or two from a hadith or a scholar and treat it like a complete proof. They ignore the chain of transmission, ignore whether the hadith is weak or authentic, and quote scholars out of context, using one paragraph from a long book as if it's the scholar's final ruling. You'll often see this online. For example, people quote the hadith that says, "From among my followers there will be some people who will consider musical instruments lawful," and they present it as if the Prophet himself allowed music, or as if the hadith is unreliable. They'll say, "See, Bukhari mentioned it, but scholars disagreed, so music must be fine." This is a common clip passed around on social media. But that's a misuse. Not every narration is equal in strength. Some are sorry, some are weak, and some appear in different wordings. You can't treat a hadith like a short quote for an Instagram caption and skip the verification step. Scholars like those at Seeker's Guidance explain that narrations about music include a mix of authentic and weak reports, so people who quote just one line without context are being careless. The truth is, scholars spend years studying chains, variants, and supporting evidence. You can't be your own scholar with a 1-minute TikTok clip. Another reason people say music is halal is the "times have changed" argument. They claim that music was haram in the past, but not anymore. They say, back then people were different. Music led to vice, but now it doesn't. So rulings must change. Or they argue that Islamic rulings were made for an old culture, so modern times allow new readings. This argument sounds attractive because it makes the speaker look progressive. It tells people, we're modern, we understand better now. But that's not how Islamic law works. Islamic rulings are not based on culture alone, they are based on Qur'an, Sunnah, consensus, and sound reasoning. You can't throw away a clear ruling just because time has passed. Unless there's strong new evidence, many rulings remain timeless. There's also a big difference between context and principle. If something is forbidden because it distracts from worship or leads to sin, then that principle still applies no matter how modern you are. Saying, "times have changed," is just a shortcut. If you think a ruling is outdated, you must bring proper proof, not just say, "I feel modern." Feelings don't change law. Another claim people use is, there's no clear verse in the Qur'an that says music is haram. They'll say, "Show me one verse that mentions music directly. If there's none, it must be halal." But that's incomplete reasoning. The Qur'an does address the concept. In Surah Luqman, verse 6, Allah says, "And among the people is he who buys idle talk to mislead others from the path of Allah." The phrase idle talk, or la al-hadith, has been explained by classical scholars to include singing, musical amusements, and distractions that turn the heart away from remembrance of Allah. Many tafsirs list music and songs directly under this verse. So it's wrong to say the Qur'an is silent, it's just that people don't read the explanations behind the verses. Also, rulings in Islam don't always come from a single verse. They come from a combination of verses, authentic hadiths, and scholarly reasoning. Saying, no verse names music is like saying, no verse names smoking, even though the harm is clear. Then there's the emotional defense. People say, music helps me feel peace. It calms me. It makes me closer to Allah. Who are you to take that from me? This argument sounds convincing because it's personal and emotions are powerful. But feeling peace doesn't make something halal. A lot of things that are forbidden also bring temporary comfort. Wine relaxes people. Gambling gives excitement. That doesn't make them lawful. And yes, science agrees that music affects emotions. Studies show that it influences the brain's reward and stress systems. It can calm you, but it can also stir passion, change your mood, or make you addicted to emotional highs. That's exactly why scholars are cautious. Something that powerful over the heart must be handled with care. Some jurists did allow simple singing without instruments in limited, controlled settings, but they warned that music which stirs desire, causes neglect of prayer, or is mixed with haram acts is not allowed. The emotional defense might apply to gentle recitation-like songs, but not to the kind of music people use for pleasure or escape today. So yes, you may genuinely feel peace. But law and faith don't follow feelings, feelings can deceive. Science itself says music rewires emotional circuits. That's why the Prophet warned against things that alter the heart. Feelings are proof of effect, not proof of permissibility. Finally, we have the cherry-picking argument. Some people quote one scholar or one permissive opinion and act like it's the majority view. They ignore centuries of scholarship and quote whoever agrees with their desire. Online, you'll see people quoting modern names like Yusuf al-Qaradawi who said music might be allowed under certain conditions. But they ignore the part where he adds strict limitations, and they ignore the fact that most classical scholars, across the 4 madhhabs, disagreed with that view. The majority considered musical instruments impermissible or at least strongly discouraged. This is confirmation bias. It's when someone already loves something and goes hunting for an opinion that allows it. Finding a scholar who agrees with you doesn't make you right. You have to look at the strength of the evidence and the consensus of the ummah. Don't make a lone permissive fatwa sound like the mainstream position. So these are the main arguments: misuse of weak opinions, claiming times have changed, demanding a literal verse, using emotion as proof, and cherry-picking scholars. And now that we've seen what they say, it's time to look at the truth. In the next section, we'll break down the real evidence and show why most serious scholars, past and present, warned against music the way it's used today. Now we move to the reality, why music is considered haram by the majority of scholars and why serious evidence points that way. We will look at 3 kinds of proof: textual, scholarly, and psychological, so you can see how they all come together. Start with the Qur'an. In Surah Luqman, Allah says in a verse often translated as, "And of mankind is he who purchases idle talk to mislead from the path of Allah." The phrase translated as idle talk comes with a richer meaning in classical tafsir. The early commentators explained that this phrase covers more than just gossip or silly speech. They included amusements and entertainments that distract people from the remembrance of Allah, and that list, in classical works, often names singing and musical pleasures specifically. When scholars read this verse, they do not treat it in isolation. They read the language, the context, and how the companions and early Muslims understood the kinds of things that divert hearts from worship. So when the Qur'an warns against idle talk that misleads people, the historic interpretation by many tafsir scholars is that music, as a widespread form of amusement that pulls people away, falls under that warning. Now the hadith evidence. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was reported to have said, "There will be among my ummah those who will make lawful fornication, silk, alcohol, and musical instruments." This narration appears in the major hadith collections and is commonly cited in discussions about music. The wording is strong and explicit. Musical instruments are mentioned in the same sentence as activities and things that are clearly forbidden or strongly discouraged in Islam. When a text groups musical instruments alongside obvious harms like alcohol and fornication, it signals seriousness. Classical scholars treated such a grouping as weighty and not trivial. They did not dismiss the hadith as a casual remark, rather, they read it as a warning about how musical entertainments can be tied to moral decay and distraction from Allah. When we examine what early and respected scholars said, the picture becomes clearer. Ibn Taymiyyah and his student Ibn al-Qayyim wrote extensively on the moral and spiritual harms of music. They argued that music can inflame the passions, dull the conscience, and make people more susceptible to immoral behavior. Their concern was not merely about the sound itself but about the effects it produces in real life, how it is used, with what company, and what it leads to. This is a consistent theme across many classical authorities. The ruling is deeply tied to the typical effects music has had in society rather than being a technical judgment about single notes or rhythms. The four main imams of Sunni jurisprudence approached the issue with seriousness. While there are fine points of difference among jurists, the dominant trend in classical fiqh treated musical instruments as either impermissible or at least strongly disliked in the contexts where they promote frivolity, immorality, or neglect of religious duties. The legal positions were formed from a combination of Quranic warnings, prophetic narrations, the understanding of the companions, and the observed consequences in society. Importantly, the ruling was never purely theoretical. It came from watching what music produced: parties that led to late nights and neglect of prayer, gatherings that mixed singing with indecent behavior, and songs that stirred sexual or immoral desire. Scholars were responding to patterns, not to isolated academic puzzles. The consensus among early scholars was not an emotional reaction but a considered legal and moral assessment. When jurists wrote about music, they repeatedly emphasized the effect on the heart and on practical life. The classical juristic voice said, if something habitually pulls the heart away from remembrance of Allah, if it fosters sinful behavior, or if it is commonly accompanied by vice, then it must be treated cautiously and often prohibited. This is why rulings appear strict. They reflect concern for the heart and the community, not a petty dislike of melody. Tafsir scholars and jurists often quote each other's work and examine the same verses and narrations. In their writings you see a repeated argument. The prohibition or disapproval is about the usual consequences, not merely the absent-minded enjoyment of a tune. They make a distinction between isolated, contextual examples, a simple religious chant without instruments in a controlled setting, for instance, and the mass culture of pop music, concerts, and parties that have historically been connected to moral decline. That distinction is crucial. The legal tradition wasn't condemning harmless, private sounds in an intellectual vacuum. It was warning against the social reality where music is intertwined with negligence and desire. This brings us to the logical and psychological side. Music is not neutral. It affects people. Neuroscience and psychology show that music activates the brain's reward systems, stirs emotions, and can alter mood rapidly. It can soothe, yes, but it can also excite, inflame, or create dependency on certain emotional states. That's why songs become tied to memories, moods, and even addictive patterns of behavior. A tune can make a person long for a lifestyle, normalize certain language, or encourage a mood that weakens restraint. The very power that allows a lullaby to calm a child is the same power that allows a sensual song to intensify desire or a riotous anthem to stoke aggression. The instrument is the same mechanism, what changes is content and context. Compare how music typically makes a person feel with how the Qur'an moves the heart. The Qur'an calls to remembrance, humility, accountability, and submission. Recitation of the Qur'an tends to direct the heart toward awe and reflection, toward moral responsibility and a focus on the hereafter. Music, in large portions of popular culture, is designed to provoke and maintain emotional engagement that often directs attention outward, to self, to pleasure, to immediate sensation. This is not a moralizing point with no data behind it. Clinical and experimental studies have documented how music modulates stress hormones, dopamine release, and emotional arousal. These biochemical changes explain why songs can be so compelling and why communities can become habituated to certain musical cultures that deprioritize religious practice. So the argument is practical. If a common habit produces measurable changes in the heart and behavior that move a person away from worship, if it habituates desire or diminishes restraint, then the ruling will reflect that reality. That is why scholars focused on the heart and the deen, not because they hated music, but because they wanted to protect what the heart turns toward. In short, the religious texts point to music as part of the kinds of idle amusements and moral distractions warned against in Scripture. The prophetic tradition explicitly links musical instruments with other harms. Early scholars, from the Imams to Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim, read those texts carefully and emphasized the observed effects on individual and societies. And modern psychology confirms that music has powerful, sometimes addictive effects on the brain and emotions, which helps explain why the classical caution remains relevant today. Up next, we will take these points and show how to answer the common permissive claims one by one, using the exact texts and scholar statements so the debate is settled by evidence, not by what's trendy. First, let's deal with the common lines people use to defend music. These aren't sophisticated arguments, they're emotional cover and clever shortcuts. We'll answer them clearly and calmly so there's no confusion. People often say, but I only listen to halal nasheeds. This sounds harmless at first, and for some listeners it may genuinely be sincere. But the phrase halal nasheeds needs unpacking. What do you mean by nasheed? Is it purely vocal, or does it use instruments? Different instruments have been treated differently by scholars. Historically, the simplest context allowed by many jurists is unaccompanied vocal recitation or singing that avoids sexualized or immoral content. Percussion instruments like the duff, a frame drum, were permitted in limited social contexts by a number of early scholars for celebrations such as weddings. But stringed instruments, wind instruments, and arrangements intended to imitate the full production of pop music are what classical authorities most often objected to. The reason is practical. Instruments that create a concert-like atmosphere tend to be associated with late-night parties, immodest behavior, and settings that encourage neglect of duties. So when someone claims, "I only listen to halal nasheeds," ask what they mean by halal and what exactly they listen to. A lyric that praises Allah or motivates good action is not automatically blameless if it's produced and consumed in a culture of desire, sexualization, or distraction. The content, the context, and the musical arrangement all matter. If you want a short line to use in the video, if your Nasheed uses full musical production, layered instruments, studio effects, and beats built to hook listeners, you are no longer in the simple zone classical scholars discussed. Labels don't make something halal, the effect and context do. Next is the emotional defense. Music helps me connect with Allah. This is powerful because it's personal and it appeals to conscience. But feeling spiritual while listening to music does not automatically prove the act is religiously permissible. Emotions can be deceiving. Something that brings tears or peace in the short term can still pull the heart away from its duties in the long term. Think about other pleasurable things that sometimes feel spiritual in the moment, yet remain forbidden because of their broader impact. Law and ethics do not follow private feelings alone. There is also a psychological reality here. Music is engineered to produce emotional responses. That's why film scores swell at the turning point and radio hooks replay in your head. That same mechanism can be used in ways that distract the soul from deliberate remembrance and accountability. A false sense of closeness to Allah, produced by a manufactured emotional high, must be examined. Is the feeling prompting you to more prayer, humility, and obedience, or is it replacing those things with sentimentalism? Use this line in the video: feeling moved does not equal being guided. The heart can be moved by many things that don't lead to Allah. Finally, the frequent claim: there are scholars who permit it. This is perhaps the most abused line online because it sounds authoritative. It's true that in the long history of Islam there are scholars who have nuanced or more permissive views about certain forms of singing or specific instruments in specific contexts. But quoting a single permissive scholar and presenting that as the decisive ruling is dishonest if you ignore how that opinion was reached, who said it, and what limitations were attached. Real scholarship is not a soundbite. Qualified scholarship rests on methodology, mastery of Arabic, knowledge of hadith science, familiarity with the juristic tradition, the ability to weigh evidence, and humility about where consensus lies. A scholar's opinion is strong when it is the outcome of careful ijtihad, supported by textual evidence and by a track record of recognized scholarship. Contrast that with modern entertainers or social media personalities who call themselves scholars because they read a paragraph online. They often lack the tools to evaluate chains of transmission, to place narrations in context, or to judge how a permissive opinion fits into the broader tradition. In other words, an Instagram clip from someone with no background in classical methodology is not comparable to the considered view of jurists who spent years in study. There is also the issue of audience and motive. A public figure who wants likes and views will naturally frame permissive rulings in a way that flatters the crowd. A true jurist's duty is to weigh harms and benefits, even if the conclusion is unpopular. So when you encounter scholars who permit it in a clip, ask, where did that opinion come from, what were its limits, and how widely accepted is it? If it's a minority view, present it honestly as a minority view with caveats, don't parade it as mainstream consensus. To summarize these rebuttals in a way you can read on camera, saying, "I listen to halal nasheeds, music brings me peace," or "scholars allow it," are not final answers. We must ask what halal means in practice, whether the emotional effect is leading you closer to prayer or replacing it, and whether the quoted scholar's view is a careful minority opinion or a mainstream ruling. Labels, feelings, and isolated opinions don't settle a legal or spiritual matter. Evidence, context, and method do. When we twist Islam to suit our desires, we are not modernizing the religion, we are corrupting it. Say that out loud. It sounds harsh because it is harsh. Islam is not a menu you pick from when you like the flavor and leave the rest on the plate. It is a divine guidance meant to shape our hearts, our families, and our communities. When we begin to reshape that guidance to match what comforts us or entertains us, the changes are rarely harmless. They start small, a song here, a late-night party there, and then the small becomes normal. Normalization spreads like a slow poison. A harmless-sounding trend goes viral, people applaud it, influencers repost it, and what was once frowned upon becomes fashionable. Children grow up thinking what their elders accepted as harmless was a sign of modern wisdom, not moral erosion. The next generation inherits a culture that has been softened at the edges until the sharp boundaries of right and wrong begin to blur. Communities that once protected modesty and restraint begin to excuse small things that lead to larger transgressions. That pattern is how fitna spreads, not in sudden storms, but in quiet, daily shifts where desire is slowly given more space than discipline. This is the reality the texts warned about. The Qur'an reminds us that Satan works to mislead people in subtle ways, and one of the methods mentioned is through voice. In Surah Al-Isra, the warning is clear: Satan promises to whisper and to incite with voices that are tempting and deceiving. The phrase points to influence that comes through what we hear, seductive words, enticing songs, and persuasive speech that normalizes what once seemed wrong. The danger is not only that we listen, it is that we begin to trust those voices and act as if their permission is the same as divine approval. Think practically for a moment. A single popular song can change language, lower inhibitions, and make certain behaviors seem normal. A trending clip can make late-night partying look glamorous. A comedian's offhand joke about religion can become the template for how an entire audience thinks about reverence. When social norms shift this way, it becomes harder for individuals to resist. Pressure mounts. The young ask why they should be different. The old, tired from fighting cultural currents, sometimes give in. The result is not just isolated sins, it is a weakened moral fabric, families that lose their center, and mosques that find fewer hearts focused on the message they teach. There's also a spiritual consequence that is often missed in public argument: the slow hardening or distraction of the heart. A heart that is repeatedly fed with cheap thrills will find less room for deep reflection and sincere worship. The voice that once moved it toward Allah becomes quieter compared to the louder voices of entertainment and desire. That is precisely what the scholars feared, not a dislike of music itself, but the habitual turning away of the heart from the remembrance and commands of Allah. If we care for our ummah, this must sting us into action. The remedy is not to shame sincerely repentant people but to bring them back gently and firmly. We must remind our communities of the cost of normalization. We must teach our children the value of restraint and the power of the Qur'an and Sunnah to fill the heart in ways that passing pleasures cannot. We must hold our influencers and elders accountable, not by policing every playlist, but by refusing to let entertainment drown out the moral voice of the community. When we twist Islam to suit our desires, we do not modernize, we corrupt. And when corruption becomes fashionable, fitna spreads quietly, through voices, songs, and jokes, until the boundaries of the deen are lost. The only way back is honesty, knowledge, and a return to the practices that protect the heart. If you've fallen into it, this isn't to shame you, it's to wake you up. The tone here is not condemnation, it's recovery. Habits can be changed, and hearts can be healed. If you want to move away from music that distracts or harms your faith, here are concrete, practical steps you can take starting today. Begin by replacing the soundtrack of your life. Don't leave it to willpower alone, change your environment. Make playlists of Qur'an recitation, beneficial lectures, or short reminders and play them where you used to play songs. In the morning, replace your usual playlist with a short surah or a 5-minute talk. When you commute, switch the radio to Qur'an, nasheeds without instruments, or a short lecture that reminds you of purpose. Set your phone so that alarms and notifications use the voice of a reciter or a short dua instead of a song. Small changes like this accumulate. Over weeks, your emotional triggers will rewire, your ears will expect different sounds, and your heart will begin to respond differently. Next, fill the gap with benefit. If you use music to relax, find alternatives that soothe but don't pull you away spiritually. Try deep breathing while listening to a slow recitation, read a short beneficial book, listen to classical Arabic poetry that praises the Prophet, or play calm lectures on patience and gratitude. If music was your companion for loneliness, join a study circle, a halaqah, or an online class that meets weekly. Community replaces the emptiness that music once filled. Make dua sincerely and specifically. Ask Allah for guidance, for strength to change habits, and for steadfastness in small steps. Dua is not a magical shortcut, it's the engine of transformation. Give the dua words, ask for steadfastness in prayer, for a heart that loves what pleases Allah, and for protection from that which clouds your judgment. Pray in private, be consistent, and trust that Allah rewards sincere effort even if the change is gradual. Limit exposure to the sources that keep pulling you back. Unfollow or mute influencers who mock the deen or who normalize behavior you're trying to leave. You don't need to make a public statement, your spiritual safety is private. If certain apps or playlists trigger temptation, remove them. Replace late-night scrolling with a short remembrance session or a planned 20-minute reading. If friends pressure you, set simple boundaries, take a walk, excuse yourself politely, or change the subject to something constructive. Boundaries are not betrayal, they are protection. Create accountability. Tell a trusted friend, a teacher, or a family member that you want to change, and ask them to check on you. Set small, measurable goals. Replace 30 minutes of music a day with beneficial audio, attend one halakha a week, or memorize and reflect on a new short surah each fortnight. Track progress privately and celebrate small wins. Change is built from tiny, repeatable actions. Be patient with yourself. Relapse happens, habit change is rarely linear. When you slip, don't fall into despair or self-hatred. Return quickly. Make a short dua, identify the trigger, and prepare a plan to avoid that trigger next time. Growth is slow, but consistent effort compounds. Finally, remember why you're doing this. It's not about restriction for its own sake. It's about returning the heart to the one who gave it. It's about making space for sincere worship, clearer conscience, and a life guided by purpose, not passive consumption. If you care about your akhirah, if you want children and communities that hold to principles, then the small sacrifices you make now will protect larger blessings later. So take these steps. Replace music with Qur'an and beneficial talks. Make sincere dua for guidance and strength. Stay away from influencers and accounts that mock the deen. Build new habits, set boundaries, and seek support. Be patient, be consistent, and trust in Allah's mercy. Don't let clowns lead your soul to destruction. And that is the truth. If you found this beneficial, then don't keep it to yourself. Share it, because falsehood spreads fast, and truth needs people who will carry it louder, clearer, and without fear. The Prophet said, "Whoever guides someone to goodness will have a reward like the one who did it." So when you share a reminder, when you defend the truth, you're not just clicking a button, you're joining a struggle. A struggle against ignorance, against deception, against the normalization of sin. If this video reminded you of something you'd forgotten, or gave you clarity on something people keep twisting, then subscribe, stay connected, and help build a space where truth has a voice again. Because this isn't just another channel, it's a stand. A stand for clarity when the world confuses everything. A stand for conviction when everyone else chooses comfort. A stand for Islam, unchanged and unfiltered. So, like the video, subscribe if you haven't, and comment your thoughts below. Tell me what you think, what you've learned, or even what you disagree with, because discussion refines understanding, and truth has nothing to fear from questions. May Allah keep our hearts firm upon the truth, protect us from the whispers of shaitan, and make us among those who hear what is right, and follow it. Until next time, stay grounded, stay sincere, and never let clowns define your deen. See you in the next one.